Welcome to the Who, What, Why podcast. I'm your host, Jeff Schechtman. Stories of environmental degradation proliferate around the globe. The abuse of resources, combined with the impacts of climate change, has created unspeakable danger for the human condition in too many places. And while much of this is taking place in the third world, the U.S. is not immune. As the American West faces shortages of water, the quality of that water becomes more essential. In many cases, the forces responsible for the man-made degradation are powerful multinational corporations, often with resources and influence far beyond fraying local governments, and in many cases even more powerful than national governments, particularly in the third world. However, the good news is there are increasing examples of grassroots efforts to try and turn things around. Some have even been very successful. Perhaps the penultimate effort has been in El Salvador in the early 2000s. My guest, John Cavanna, was a part of that effort. John is the director of the Washington-based Institute for Policy Studies. He formerly did research on corporate power for the UN, and is the author of the book, The Water Defenders. It is my pleasure to welcome John Cavanna here to the Who, What, Why podcast. John, thanks so much for joining us.
Great to be with you today.
John, begin by talking about how this successful effort in El Salvador actually began.
Well, it all began when people, as folks in El Salvador referred to them, men in white suits came in the early 2000s, where mineral prices were going up all around the world. And in northern El Salvador, there's a lot of gold and there's silver. Prices were going up in part because people were buying more cell phones and computers, which use these minerals, which use gold to conduct electricity. And as the prices went up, mines that had been closed down decades before, when prices were low, all of a sudden looked very profitable to these companies. So they descended and said to the people in the north, look, we'll bring you jobs, we'll bring you prosperity because you'll get some of the revenues from the gold. Let us in. And that's the beginning of this tale. And this story was repeating itself all over the world, so not just in northern El Salvador. And the people there, as we got to know them, said this sounded very good. It's a poor part of the world, northern El Salvador. Most of the people are farmers of beans and corn. And so it sounded good. So that's the beginning point.
Was there any initial resistance to this idea?
Not right off the bat. However, many of the people had been across the border. So northern El Salvador, there's a river that goes right across the top of it that separates it from Honduras. That is actually, and then it plunges through El Salvador. It's the source of water for over half of the people in that country. And a number of the people in this area knew people in Honduras, in part because they'd been forced across that river to live in refugee camps during the brutal civil war in El Salvador in the 1980s. So they said, we remember there are a lot of mines up there, let's go visit them. So very quickly after the men in suits arrived, they organized a delegation, they went to a big open pit mine, and what they saw shocked them, which is, first they learned that in almost all industrial gold mining, the mining companies use cyanide to separate the gold from the rock. And once you do that and you cover all these rocks with cyanide, it's very hard to contain it. And so they saw dead fish. They saw basically a dead river coming out of this mine, dead fish, people with skin diseases. And they also saw a lot of local conflict because the mining companies, like most big companies, they come in with money and they're offering local elected officials money to accept their desire to mine there. And that immediately, so some of the community sees the environmental effects and become opposed. Others think, oh my God, we can make a ton of money. They become in favor, and conflicts emerge. So pretty quickly they saw that, they came back and they concluded, oh my gosh, we're a country like California right now. We don't have much water. Therefore, we've really got to protect the water we have. And they started to educate their neighbors and the people in their community about the dangers of mining.
And as they did that, how was that met by the political establishment?
Well, the political establishment, and this is interesting because in a country like this, you've got both local governments and you've got the national government. The national governments usually look at the numbers. Gold, by the way, sells for $1,800 an ounce. It's way more precious than just about anything else you can buy. The national governments, even though they're only going to be getting 1% of the profits, it's really kind of a scam by the mining companies. Still, that's a ton of money. So they're for it. Local governments tend to be for it. So because they also, for them, they get 1% also. It's a huge amount of money for them. So pretty immediately they ran into opposition from the local governments, who really just wanted them to go away. So fascinating few years in the early 2000s. The people, most of them farmers who begin to oppose mining, are incredibly creative. There's a wonderful community radio station there run by youth. They started doing education on mining. These people educated themselves. They learned about mining. They learned about water and hydrology. And so they held seminars. They did marches with using laughter and creative cultural work, dances and all sorts of things that would pull the community in. And pretty quickly, the majority of people in the communities were opposed. So this again plays itself out in communities in the U.S. when a big Walmart wants to expand. The company then starts throwing money around. So it went to the people who were opposing it and said, what do you need? And how much money can we give you to win you over? They're not incredibly subtle about it. And these people said, no, water is more important than gold, and therefore nothing. You can't offer us anything. We're opposed. And so, as in Honduras, the conflict emerges. My wife, Robin Broad, and I got involved in the story 5 years in when we give out at my institute in Washington a Human Rights Award every year, and the Human Rights, the selection committee selected this group of people fighting mining. None of us had heard of them. We were excited, but what knocked us over the edge very quickly was a month after we told them that they were getting the award, and we started to arrange for 5 of them to come to Washington, D.C., and then to send them on a tour, we got the horrible news that one of the local leaders, a man named Marcelo Rivera, who was a great cultural worker, had been assassinated and his body brutally tortured and found in the bottom of a well. And you can imagine, for us here, we've already gotten a visa for this guy. He's coming to us. And so that led us into thinking this is different. In the end, they sent his brother in his place. And these people organized us. They pulled us into the fight. And in a very obvious way, they said, look, we can fight this in El Salvador, but you have much more access to information about the company. It was a Canadian company, 1. And 2, they told us something that was even more bizarre. They said, look, as we've been able to slow down new mining licenses in El Salvador, as we've spread the word, the mining company has come back and sued our government in a tribunal right near you in Washington, D.C. It's based at the World Bank. We need your help. So it's interesting. We thought this would maybe be a week of research and help, but we got sucked in. And here we are now, 12 years after that fateful meeting here in Washington, D.C., and these people have become some of our best friends, very close relationships, and amazing things came out of this friendship.
Talk a little bit about how the movement grew. Was it a grassroots effort? Did it have top-down leadership? Give us a sense of how the movement really started to gain the kind of traction you're talking about.
Sure. Well, as they did their education in northern El Salvador, and none of these people were leaders or well-known. They truly were ordinary folks. Some of them worked for a nonprofit that helped farmers shift into organic agriculture. As they did that education work, they concluded pretty quickly, okay, we may be able to put up good opposition to the company here, but our bigger goal, now that we know the dangers of mining to the whole country, is to end mining in this country. We're only going to do that if we go national. This is a country of about 6.5 million people. And there's another 2 million Salvadorans here in the United States. So as we began to work on this, we immediately had a lot of people who were quite eager to join and help. But they went national, and they did their education, and quickly they won onto their side faith groups, environmental groups, women's groups, youth groups. Everyone was attracted to this larger slogan of water is life. So they built a pretty good, strong national coalition. But however, El Salvador is as polarized as the United States. Actually, in their case, it's even more difficult. At this time, 2/3 of the legislators, our equivalent of Congress people, were from conservative parties. So they were doing this great education, building this great coalition, and yet we sitting pretty far back, we looked at this and we said, oh boy, their chances of actually changing those laws are next to none, even with a big coalition. And our chances of helping them win this case in this tribunal are also pretty slim, because the tribunal rules were set up to favor the corporation. They've been written really with the help of corporations, and it's a tribunal where corporations can sue governments. Right now, a big corporation in Canada is suing the Biden administration for $15 billion for stopping the building of that pipeline, that Trans-Canada pipeline that would come into the U.S. So corporations can sue government, but governments and communities can't sue back. And you also, it's a very narrow set of rules that you can look at. In this case, was the mining company promised that it could mine? You can't bring in environmental issues. You can't bring in, we've got to save our rivers. So it's a rigged court, and the legislature was rigged. So some of you listeners might be saying, why'd you all keep doing this with the odds so stacked against you? And I have to be honest, we knew they were heavily stacked against us. We knew we would all probably lose. But we felt this was an important fight, one, because they asked us, but two, because it helped educate people about the bigger dangers of mining. Most people don't know about that. And it helped educate people about these unequal rules that still govern much of the global economy.
While this effort was coming together, to what extent was the mining going forward?
So the mining wasn't going forward. What mining companies do is they go in there, they get first a license to explore. So this is when the communities really started to wake up. And what they do is they go in and they drill holes deep down into the soil, take up core samples, send them back to Nevada, which is the center of gold mining in the United States, and they test them. They see how much gold's in there. So the mining companies did get these licenses to explore. And even in the exploration, you're drilling these big holes, they were disrupting the water tables in the communities there. That's when people thought, oh my God, if this is affecting the water so much when they're just exploring, imagine what we'll be up against if they actually could mine. So the exploration stage went forward. These communities found a few allies in the environment minister and the government responded by saying, okay, we better study this. We better step back and study it, so no new mining licenses until we figured it out. And it was at that point that the mining company said, wait a second, there was an implicit deal here that we could mine, so we're suing you. And we're jumping over your courts, and we're going to Washington, D.C. So no mining yet, which is great. So they weren't actually, there was no cyanide going into the rivers, but their water tables had already been disrupted by 500 wells being driven hundreds of feet down into the rock.
And as you write about, in this period of time, something like 60% of the country became opposed to the idea of this mining going forward. How did that impact those in power?
Yeah, so that, politicians, I must say it's true here in Washington too. What is the first thing they read in the morning when they get up? They read public opinion polls. They know they have to get reelected. It's a terrible thing to say, and it may sound a little bit cynical. Here, what's fascinating is that the water defenders, as they built this national coalition, and they did creative education now nationally, And one of the critical things in that country, this country, the U.S. is still a very religious country. El Salvador more so, and in El Salvador, the vast majority of people are Catholic. So they figured out pretty early on, let's try to win over the Catholic Church. Now, most of their people said, are you crazy? There's a very conservative archbishop. He's pro-business. He comes from something called Opus Dei, which is incredibly conservative. They said, don't even try. But this is what we loved about these folks. They said, no, let's try. So they called. The archbishop blew them off. Finally, they got a meeting. They got in there, and I've been in meetings like this. He was not interested. He was reading stuff on his desk. And then one of them mentions cyanide, that you use cyanide to separate the gold from the rock. And all of a sudden, you know, his face lights up, and he says, cyanide? Oh, my God, I have a degree in chemistry, and I know that stuff is toxic. We can't have that in our rivers. So they turn the archbishop. He then gets the priests and the local churches to talk about mining. They do a sort of educational sessions with the water defenders, and all of a sudden you have the church as a huge educational platform. So you're right, quite early on, 2007, the independent poll shows 62% opposed, and that's why the government said, okay, whoa, we better slow down and look at this. Now, at that stage, they just thought they would look at it and figure out a way around this and get back to mining. The government wanted those revenues, but in pausing, they invited these lawsuits. And it's outrageous that mining companies can do this, but this is one of the realities of mining companies.
What other pushback was there from the mining companies beyond just in the courts?
Oh, well, they do. I mean, it's like Washington, D.C. is filled with corporate lobbyists. So imagine the same thing in San Salvador. They came in, they refused to talk to us, but we got a treasure trove of their documents from two places. The lawyer for El Salvador got the documents from the lawsuit here made public. So we saw a lot of their emails. And then one of the mining company executives, I think later on, felt guilty about all this and gave a whole bunch of documents to a graduate student who worked for my wife at American University. Those documents were fascinating. So they were infiltrating all of the meetings of the water defenders, and then they were doing their best to do PR. A lot of it was PR. They did try to buy off local officials, and they did buy them off in effect. They gave lots of money to all sorts of things, schools and to the soccer leagues and so on in northern El Salvador. Walmart does the exact same thing when it wants to come into a community. So they tried to buy people off. And then they did another thing, which ended up being one of their Achilles heels. They said, look, you people, they sort of insulted people. They said, you're stupid. If you were smart, you'd know that this is a good way to get wealthy. And if you could just see our mine in the Philippines, halfway around the world, they I think strongly suspected that few Salvadorans had been there, you would see what a green and sustainable mining company we are. So this is one place where the international support was really helpful. A number of us, including Robin and I, we'd been to their mine in northern Philippines, and we knew it was a disaster and all the same problems that the water defenders had seen in Honduras. So we helped them arrange to bring this very good, strong, activist governor from the province where their mine was in the Philippines to El Salvador. And he testified before Congress, he spoke before public forums, he met the president, and he showed these amazing before and after slides of a beautiful mountain and then a horrible pit with polluted water. And he helped dispel the myth of the mining company that they could be green and sustainable. And I want to say to your listeners, this is a shocking thing for me. Look around your room, it's filled with products made out of metals. It is almost impossible to mine these things sustainably. And it led us to the conclusion by the end, it led the Salvadorans to the conclusion that they could not have mining. It led us to the conclusion that we need to get rid of about half of the mines in the world, mines near indigenous communities, near biodiversity regions, near earthquake zones. And we can do that if we just start recycling most of the metals we use. But most people don't know about this. It's interesting, we're in a country in a world where most people now know the horrible dangers of climate change, but very few know of the horrible dangers of mining and its threat to our water systems everywhere.
Will we get to a point, though, because of the pressures that you're talking about, the global pressures, and we still will talk about the global pressure that really helped those that were opposing the mine, will we get to a point where there may be a sustainable way to get these resources out of the ground?
You know, on a small scale, I think of the history of California. So California starts, there are a few thousand people in California, then somebody discovers gold in a river near Sacramento in the 1840s, and all of a sudden, California explodes. In the early days, they were just panning gold out of rivers. That's completely sustainable. I've seen small-scale mines that are not using chemicals that are sustainable. But on a big scale, it's almost impossible to do it sustainably. I'm open to the idea that this could emerge in the next 20 years, and it's a huge challenge, Jeff, because right now, the U.S. government is about to pass a big infrastructure bill that will put huge incentives to shift from fossil fuels to clean energy and to electric cars. Electric cars use batteries made out of lithium, which has to be mined and all this in similar ways to gold. And we've been digging into this. A lot of lithium comes from Nevada, again, but also from Chile, Argentina. And it is wreaking havoc in much the same way that fracking does for natural gas. Some people I have heard are claiming that they figured out a way to do it a bit more sustainably in Chile. I'm very interested to see what that looks like. But I think in any future scenario that's sustainable and that protects precious water, we will be doing less mining, and we will be doing far more recycling of metals.
Of course, at the same time there's recycling, the demand for these metals keeps increasing dramatically.
It increases, but I just want to say one thing that's very interesting about gold. Gold is used, only about 10% of its uses are for industrial uses as a great conductor of electricity, and it's used, for example, in our cell phones. 90% of it isn't. Over half of it is used in jewelry. So you could imagine people just getting attached to something else there. But the thing I want to say about gold is people have estimated that gold has always been so expensive and precious that about 3/4 of all the gold ever mined is still in use. It's been recycled. I have a wedding ring that is made from recycled gold. So we can do this. Copper, more and more, is being recycled. So yes, there's new demand, but there is also great new technologies of how to recycle it more cheaply. And I can imagine in 5 years it will simply be routine that when your computer dies, your phone dies, whatever, you are bringing it down to a local place where people are working. These would be very good jobs, but simply repurposing all of the materials in your computer, in your phone, also your refrigerator, and right on down. If you did that, you would greatly reduce the demand for new minerals, and you would create millions of good jobs in the process. It seems like a no-brainer, and all it takes is more education on the dangers of mining and why this is a necessary course if we want to protect our water in the future. All over California, across the U.S., but there's over 1 billion people in the world, so over 1 in 6 that do not have access to clean and affordable water and struggle every day to get it. As those numbers go up, I think the demand to protect it and to think about mining differently will increase.
We know there's a demand for recycled copper just by the theft of catalytic converters that goes on, particularly in California.
There you go. Beautiful example. And right now, one of the biggest fights in the U.S. over mining is in Arizona on Apache lands, sacred Apache lands. John McCain wanted to build the biggest copper mine in the U.S. there, and it was about to go through before Biden was elected, and now they're slowing it down to look at the environmental costs. That's a beautiful place where we could start to turn this around in this country right away. But of course, Jeff, I mean, the the great thing about this story is that despite all of the odds that we've just talked about, in the end, the people of El Salvador did pull together, convince enough politicians on the other side of the aisle that mining would be bad, that they became in 2017 the first country in the world to ban all mining. And they defeated the mining company in this tribunal in Washington, D.C. And so, oh my God, these two incredible victories in the most unlikely place. And if they can do that there, a country where a lot of the odds are rigged against people, imagine what we can do here.
And it wasn't just that they convinced enough people, they had unanimous support. Nobody voted against the bill.
Yeah, and partly, you can't always count on this in these fights. Partly it was the stupidity and arrogance of the company. I mean, the timing was interesting. These court cases stretch out forever. So it was 7 years after the lawsuit was introduced that it was finally decided against the company. The company's reaction, this was October 2016, the company's reaction was pure arrogance. The court asked it to pay $8 million to El Salvador. They said, we're not paying. Again, you're stupid. You don't understand that this is key to your future prosperity. And that offended not just progressives, not just people who think about water a lot in poorer regions, but everybody, even more conservative politicians. And this is what's so interesting. Again, it's key individuals can play such a role. Turned out that the most conservative party there, that controlled about a third of the legislature, had as its lead person in the Environment Committee a young guy. His name is John Wright Thal. His rich family, father's a big sugar mill owner. He had gone to school in the U.S. He'd been introduced to the environmental movement. He was here when there was that big, horrible mining spill in Colorado that sent yellow effluents into this big river that then went into New Mexico and then up to Utah. He'd seen the dangers of mining, and he did more and more education. He opened his mind to the water defenders, and he concluded that this would be horrendous for the country. He, in turn, was able to pull a lot of people in his party over. And, again, here the Catholic Church played a huge role. The Catholic Church, when it was uniformly opposed, it went to politicians of all stripes, and it just said, come on. And it got people in pulpits to, call their legislators and say, you should be opposed to this. Amazing efforts over final 5 months. And at the end of March 2017, you're right, it was stunning. No one predicted this. I mean, it looked like it was going to be a super close vote. And I think in the end, these politicians simply concluded, look, we're going to lose this vote. Do we want to be on the wrong side of history? The public by this point was 80% opposed to mining. So that played a big role too. And it was a unanimous vote, the vote heard around the world. And one of the great things is that it really has had an impact on the mining debates in other countries across the region. Movements in other countries have invited the water defenders. They've told their story. And now we're in a situation where Costa Rica has largely stopped mining and based its whole economy on ecotourism and on saving the environment. Panama's restricted some mining. Argentina has. Chile and Argentina have stopped mining around their glaciers. So this truly was a vote heard around the world, and it started a very different debate. There's still mining all over the place. Most governments are still pursuing it full blast. But at least there's now a debate, and there's an alternative, and you aren't considered completely off the spectrum when you come out and say there's an alternative to this. We don't have to mine. And that's, to us, a huge victory.
John Cavanna, I thank you so much for spending time with us here on the Who, What, Why podcast. John's book is The Water Defenders, How Ordinary People Saved a Country from Corporate Greed. John, thank you so much for joining us.
Wonderful to be with you today. Thanks for getting deep enough into the story that you were able to guide that in a beautiful way.
Thank you. And thank you for listening and joining us here on the Who, What, Why podcast. I hope you join us next week for another Who, What, Why podcast. I'm Jeff Sheckman. If you like this podcast, please feel free to share and help others find it by rating and reviewing it on iTunes. You can also support this podcast and all the work we do by going to whowhatwhy.org/donate.